Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine, Wrestling Observer Newsletter September 14, 1998. Jim Duggan diagnosed with cancer. By Observer staff. The careers of three major wrestling stars of the past 2 decades have either come to a close, or are seriously threatened to be coming to a close this past week. Both Jim Duggan and Ultimo Dragon have their careers in jeopardy due to illness and injury respectively, while in an event that was a planned career finale. The great Kabuki had his retirement ceremony on September 7 at Tokyo Korakuen Hall. Duggan, 45, was diagnosed with cancer this past week and will have one of his kidneys removed and an operation scheduled for September 4. There have been athletes in other sports that have performed at the major league level with one kidney and people who have excelled after recovering from cancer, although one would think between Duggan's age, the recuperation time, and the inherent risks of performing in pro wrestling that this certainly threatens to finish his career. Dragon, 31, has suffered an infection and several other complications coming out of his recent elbow surgery and was given an opinion this past week from a doctor in Japan that he may not be able to ever return to the ring and that at a minimum he'll be out of action for another 6 months. The surgery was believed to be somewhat routine and only require about 1 month of downtime. Kabuki, 50, had a week-long final tour for IWA Japan, culminating in his retirement show on September 7 at Korakuen Hall, in which he wrestled 3 matches just 1 day before his 50th birthday. Duggan, a 21-year veteran pro wrestler, was one of the top babyfaces in American pro wrestling, doing a patriotic gimmick facing foreign menaces with a ring style that could be best described, at least during his peak years, as the top draw for Mid-South Wrestling, as a less athletic version of Bruiser Brody. The son of the police chief in his hometown of Glens Falls, New York, Duggan was a top-notch athlete dating back to Glens Falls High School where, at 250 pounds, he was a good enough football player to get numerous scholarship offers, and where he captured the state high school wrestling championship in the heavyweight division. He ended up attending Southern Methodist University, where he was a 3-year starting linebacker from 1974 to 76, including being a second-team all-conference selection. He went undrafted, but was signed as a free agent coming out of college by the Atlanta Falcons and, after breaking his wrist in preseason, spent the year on the injured reserve list. He actually started pro wrestling as a very large, particularly for that time, jobber in the old Worldwide Wrestling Federation in late 1977 as Big Jim Duggan, billed as a former pro football player with the Falcons. He also played some pro football in Canada and bounced around pro wrestling circuits with little success until leaving Joe Blanchard's Southwest Championship Wrestling office for a tryout with Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling in 1982. Arriving in Louisiana with nothing to his name but 2 baggages and no money, and within a few years turning into one of the biggest stars in the game as Hacksaw Jim Duggan, being given the nickname of a famous pro football player of a few years earlier, ironically, Butch Reed, who arrived in the circuit at about the same time, had been given the Hacksaw nickname in about a year or 2 earlier. Watts exaggerated Duggan's limited pro football career, which actually didn't even consist of him playing 1 regular season game, into billing him as a pro football headhunter who was kicked out of the NFL for using the illegal head spear too often, and was given the spear as his finishing move. He started as a heel in Mid-South and was immediately placed together with the company's best worker, Ted DiBiase, in a tag team, which set the stage for a legendary feud. DiBiase, Duggan, and Matt Bourne formed the top heel trio in the company called the Rat Pack, although from very early in the trio there were minor allusions to something in Duggan's past where he hated Arabians, which set the stage for the breakup of the Rat Pack over DiBiase doing business with Skander Akbar. While Duggan's turn into the foot-stomping, flag-waving patriot was largely for the generic rivalry with big foreign menaces like Kimala, Nikolai Volkov, and Crusher Khrushchev, Barry Darsow, or those tainted for the foreign title because of their affiliation with Akbar like one-man gang. His best feuds were brawls with great workers who could carry him, most notably DiBiase, but also the likes of Buzz Sawyer, Terry Gordy, and Dick Slater. Duggan's popularity by early 1984 was threatening and realistically surpassing Junkyard Dog's as the top babyface in the territory, and when Dog left for WWF, Duggan was the company's top draw from 1984 to his own leaving for WWF in January 1987, just a few months before Mid-South Wrestling, then known as UWF, was sold to Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987. Duggan had 1 reign as North American champion in Mid-South, beating Dick Slater on March 16, 1986 in Oklahoma City, and then vacated the title when it was replaced by the UWF World. He was also the final holder of the Louisiana heavyweight title, having beaten Mike Sharp for it when that title was done away with at the end of 1982, and held the UWF tag titles with Terry Taylor for a few weeks, beating Akbar's team of Bad Leroy Brown and Bill Irwin on December 27, 1986 in Fort Worth before the titles were vacant when Duggan jumped to the WWF. Duggan was actually considered one of the best brawlers in the game during this time period, generally ranking only below Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen. He was also a headliner for New Japan Pro Wrestling during this time period. In 1982, he won the Observer's Most Improved Wrestler award, and generally placed as high as the top 3 in the world in categories such as Most Charismatic and Best Babyface, a contrast to the latter part of his career when he placed highly frequently in Worst of categories. Perhaps the best example of his popularity would have been in the first annual Jim Crockett Sr. Memorial Tag Team Tournament held on April 19, 1986 at the Superdome. On a show that included basically every major non-WWF name in the business at the time, Duggan was far and away the most popular wrestler on the show. In the WWF, Duggan held a top spot from the beginning, stemming from his Mid-South popularity. He took the flag-waving role that Sergeant Slaughter had made such a hit with a few years earlier, and was for several years one of the top babyfaces in the company. He was the winner of the original Royal Rumble on January 24, 1988 in Hamilton, Ontario, which still ranks as the highest-rated pro wrestling television show, drawing an 8.2 rating ever on the USA Network. He also held the King title, a predecessor to the King of the Ring pay-per-view, beating Haku on April 25, 1989 in Des Moines and losing to Randy Savage on August 30, 1989 in Portland, Maine. While with the WWF, Duggan was probably most notable for 2 things. The most famous would be just a few months after joining the company, he was on a roll feuding with Iron Sheik and Volkov. While driving on the Jersey Turnpike, Duggan and Sheik, who normally didn't travel together but were on this occasion as a fluke because Sheik didn't have a ride, were caught together with some open containers and marijuana and arrested. It was a double embarrassment to the WWF because at the time they were promoting the wrestlers as kids' heroes, and while drug use was prevalent and actually astounding, it was felt drug-related stories in that era would be PR disasters. This story also received national news coverage because it was Duggan and Sheik, involved in one of the hottest feuds in the company, who were allegedly drinking and doing drugs together. Both were immediately fired, and because of this incident, the WWF began drug testing its wrestlers, although at the time only for cocaine, since that was considered the most destructive drug prevalent in the business and also the one that would cause the biggest PR mess if a wrestler was caught with. The WWF ended up rehiring Duggan several months later. Duggan's major role with the WWF ended up being as something of the understudy for Hulk Hogan. Hogan would only work major arenas, generally 2 shows per week. At the time, the WWF was running virtually every day with 3 touring groups, and Duggan would headline the Hogan Tour against Hogan's top heel opponent on the 5 days per week that Hogan wasn't there, although it meant Duggan himself never had a focused big show feud. Duggan's work rate declined greatly while with the WWF, although that wasn't unusual for wrestlers in that time period when WWF emphasized presentation and personality and put no emphasis on performance. He was also among the strongest men in the company, as Duggan did very well during this period competing in powerlifting events. From his WWF television exposure, he was one of the more in-demand indie wrestlers after he had run his course with the WWF. When Hogan signed with WCW in 1984, among the friends he brought on board was Duggan. When Ricky Steamboat had to retire due to a back injury, Duggan was basically given his spot as U.S. champion, beating Steve Austin in 35 seconds to win the title Steamboat had vacated to Austin on September 18, 1994 in Roanoke, Virginia, before losing it to Big Van Vader on December 27, 1994 at Starrcade in Nashville. Duggan continued to bounce around WCW, although his work declined greatly, for while drawing a huge salary for the time, $250,000 per year, and not even being booked. At one point he was dropped from the company, but then was quickly rehired largely for a PR role, but ended up back in the ring, where he had the ability to get a good house show pop in preliminary matches because of his name value from the 80s and his familiar shtick, particularly when the WCW tour would go through the old Mid-South territory. The story of Dragon, real name Yoshihiro Asai, is well documented. One of the most graceful and versatile performers who ever participated in the industry, Asai was a childhood fan of the original Tiger Mask and remained a huge fan throughout his career. He went to the New Japan Dojo out of high school, and while he survived the brutal camp due to his size, eventually failed his pro audition and wasn't offered a pro contract. He then, without knowing Spanish, went to Mexico as a 20-year-old and picked up lucha libre remarkably quickly, had his first pro match on May 13, 1987 in Pachuca just 3 days after arriving in Mexico, and captured the Distrito Federal Trios title with fellow Japanese stars Naoki Sano, most recently Yuhi Sano with Kingdom, and Hirokazu Hata, long since retired, within a few months. His learning lucha libre was so quick that at the end of 1987 he was named Foreign Wrestler of the Year, and later held the UWA World Welterweight title just 1 year into his career, becoming the youngest man in history, 21, to hold that title. In 1990, when Hisatsune Shinma brought a full-time lucha libre promotion called Universal Pro Wrestling, basically affiliated with the UWA, which at the time was the top promotion in Mexico, to Japan, Osai was scheduled to be the fresh young babyface behind top native star Gran Hamada. Things worked out differently, as hardcore wrestling fans in Tokyo and Nagoya made Osai, with his graceful style, hard work and unique flying moves, such as his trademark Osai moonsault, into the big star of the group, throwing money at him after his performances. In a sense, Osai and Universal changed Japanese wrestling because he was the first wrestler who was basically a middleweight who became the top star of his company. Because of his Japanese success, he was quickly given the UWA middleweight title to signify to the Japanese fans that he was indeed a superstar in Mexico for status when he would make return tours and give him a title belt to defend, which he wound up holding a record 5 times. In October of 1991, Antonio Pena lured Osai from UWA to EMLL, which behind Pena's booking, was becoming the biggest drawing wrestling company in the world at the time. Pena, whose forte was creating gimmicks, created the name Ultimo Dragon, billed as the final student of Bruce Lee, to do a martial arts tag team with Octagon, Pena's most popular created gimmick with the advent of wrestling on Mexico City television. Osai left the Universal Group in Japan as well, joining up with Genichiro Tenryu's SWS where he also worked under the mask and later wore. He began working major shows with New Japan during that time period, including becoming the first non-New Japan wrestler ever to win the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title, setting up a famous Tokyo Dome match where he dropped the title to Jushin Liger, which was actually a disappointing match. In 1996, Dragon jumped from EMLL to AAA for a short-lived run, and by the end of the year, had signed his first deal with WCW. Dragon let his war contract expire and over the past year has worked during the week in Mexico City, where he also trains many young Japanese wrestlers including Magnum Tokyo, Shima Nobunaga, Judo Suwa, and Sumo Fuji, and runs his own shows in his new home of Naucalpan while working in WCW. Without question, his career highlight would be in the period in late December of 1996 and early January of 1997, where he held an unprecedented 10 different major championships simultaneously as he captured the 8-belt J Crown in Japan from Great Sasuke to go along with the NWA middleweight title he had won from Chris Jericho in Mexico, and the WCW cruiserweight title he had won from Dean Malenko in the United States. He still remains NWA middleweight champion today. Kabuki, real name Akihisa Yone Yoshimura, was largely a journeyman pro wrestler for most of his career until Gary Hart came up with the Great Kabuki gimmick for him in Texas with his first match with the gimmick on January 10, 1981, which quickly made him one of the hottest heels in the United States and later one of the hottest babyfaces in Japan. As mentioned here previously, the Great Kabuki gimmick was actually formulated by another journeyman wrestler in the United States, a Filipino wrestler doing a Japanese gimmick named Ray Urbano in 1972 in Michigan and California, although that gimmick wasn't enough to get him out of the prelim ranks. With the ceremonial plastic mask he wore to the ring, the face paint spinning around in the ring and then blowing the dreaded mist, billed as the greatest martial arts fighter in the world, Hart not only made Kabuki in the early 80s the top heel in Texas, feuding with the entire Von Erich family, but also a headliner at the same time in Georgia for a feud with Dusty Rhodes, and due to his exposure on both Georgia and Texas television, Bill Watts at the same time brought him in as a headliner to feud with Junkyard Dog. After being replaced as the top heel in Texas by the Freebirds, he migrated to Mid-Atlantic with Hart where he mainly feuded with Jimmy Valiant, both as Valiant and under a mask as Charlie Brown when he beat Valiant in a Loser Leaves Town match, to set up Charlie Brown beating Kabuki to win the Mid-Atlantic TV title in a mid-card match at the very first Starrcade on November 24, 1983 at the Greensboro Coliseum underneath the Ric Flair title win over Harley Race, although he never got past mid-card in the Carolinas. Demand for Kabuki had been so high just 2 years earlier that Rhodes, wanting to bring him to Florida where he was the top draw to recreate his Atlanta feud, was unable to get him in full-time and instead created his own Florida version of the mist-blowing Ninja Warrior and created Kendo Nagasaki, Kazuo Sakurada, using the ring name of a very famous masked heel in England, and although many have mistaken this, the England wrestler and Sakuraba were different people, although Sakuraba got the name from the famous English heel, whose career in Japan also survived many years longer due to the gimmick, and he's still an active performer today. Without question, however, the most successful gimmick spawned by the Kabuki success would be the Great Muta, when Gary Hart brought Keiji Muto to WCW in 1989 and he became an immediate sensation as the best high-flying heavyweight wrestler in the world with his revolutionary moonsault. Muta was originally billed by Hart as the son of Kabuki, although that moniker didn't stick because Muta in the ring totally outshined whatever memories by that time fans had of Kabuki. However, at the recent August 8 Osaka Dome show where Muta and Kabuki formed a tag team, Muta's face paint read "Goodbye Daddy." The most bitter wrestling war in the world in the early 80s was between New Japan and All Japan, both of which had network primetime television. Giant Baba, who had used Mera as prelim wrestler Akihisa Takachio for most of his career, brought Kabuki back with a push in February 1983 and he became an immediate sensation as a part-time special attraction performer. For the next several years Kabuki divided his time between the different American territories, although his star in the US waned as his work rate fell from his early 80s peak, and coming in as a headliner for All Japan. In January 1987 he signed a full-time deal with All Japan and was pushed as one of the top babyfaces in the company before leaving with Genichiro Tenryu in August of 1990 to join SWS, which later became War, with Kabuki also working as booker of the company. His leaving was a bitter pill for Baba, since he was just moved up the ladder to number 2 babyface in the company behind Jumbo Tsuruta after Tenryu had rated much of his talent, and Tsuruta and Kabuki were just given the double tag team titles from Steve Williams and Terry Gordy on the proviso that Kabuki was going to stay loyal. But instead, Kabuki left Baba for SWS. He had a short run shaving his head as part of the Skinheads with New Japan before going to Tokyo Pro Wrestling in 1995, and when that group folded, joined the IWA in 1997. Kabuki wrestled 3 matches on September 7 at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,150 fans for his retirement show. First, he teamed with Shigeo Okamura to beat Zapp and Masao Orihara. Then he was pinned with a small package by IWA's top native wrestler Keisuke Yamada in 8-14. Yamada was responsible for bringing Kabuki to the company and was the winner of a tournament held earlier in the week to get the final singles match with him. Finally, in the main event, Kabuki teamed with Terry Funk and Doug Gilbert to beat Leatherface, Rick Patterson, and Metalface, Eddie Watts, and Freddy Krueger when Kabuki pinned Krueger after a lariat in 10:35. Kabuki, who cried in the ring during his retirement ceremony theoretically ending a 35-year career, will continue to work behind the scenes with IWA in booking and is planning on opening up a restaurant. Among those in attendance at the show were Tenryu, Shiro Koshinaka, and Kunyaki Kobayashi. Akihisa Mera's pro wrestling story dates back to his joining the Old Japanese Wrestling Alliance at the age of 15 after graduating junior high school in his hometown of Nobioka. He was given the ring name Akihisa Takachiho, which was the name of the section of his hometown that he was from. He wrestled in Japan as a prelim wrestler from 1964 to 1970 when he left for his first tour of the United States using such ring names as Devil Sato, Tennessee, Yoshino Sato, in Michigan as a tag team partner of Mitsu Arakawa, and Professor Takachio, in California doing the Japanese tag team gimmick with such partners as Masa Saito and Kinji Shibuya. In 1972, when the JWA was in its dying days due to Giant Baba having left the company and with help of Dory Funk Sr., getting NWA recognition for his new All Japan promotion combined with other financial problems, Takachio was called back to Japan to help save the company and be along with Seiji Sakaguchi and Kentaro Oki as the 3 top stars of the company. To give him credibility, Takachio and Sakaguchi captured the annual tag team tournament at the end of the year, and on March 8, 1973 in Sano, Takachio captured the United National Heavyweight title, part of today's Triple Crown, from Johnny Valentine. However, the promotion folded 1 month later and Baba hired him as a prelim wrestler. He also during the 70s formed a Top Hill tag team in Australia with Samsung Sawada. He left Japan again in 1979 wrestling first in West Texas as Akio Moto, forming a tag team with the likes of Akio Sato, John Tolos and Mr. Pogo, and then went to Central States in 1980 as part of a Japanese tag team with Pak Song, Akio Sato and also Killer Carl Cox before adopting the Kabuki gimmick that made and saved his career. Great Kabuki Career Title History. Source: Wrestling Title History's 3rd edition, Wrestling Observer Newsletter Records. NWA International and PWF World Tag Titles, with Jumbo Tsuruta defeated Terry Gordy and Steve Williams July 19, 1990 Tokyo, vacated titles when Kabuki jumped to Super World Sports. United National Heavyweight, as Akihisa Takachio defeated Johnny Valentine March 8, 1973 Sano, title vacated when JWA Promotion folded April 20, 1973. All Asian Tag Titles, as Akihisa Takachio with Samson Suwata defeated Jerry and Ted Oates October 21, 1976 Gifu, lost to Great Kojika and Motoshi Okuma June 16, 1977 Tokyo. Mid-Atlantic TV title, defeated Jos LeDuc June 1983, lost to Charlie Brown, Jimmy Valiant November 24, 1983 Greensboro. NWA American Heavyweight defeated Kerry Von Erich September 25, 1981 Lawton Hockey, lost fictitious match to Bugsy McGraw. Texas Brass Knucks title, defeated Bugsy McGraw 1983, lost to Terry Gordy March 25, 1983 Dallas, defeated Gino Hernandez August 1985, lost to Abdullah the Butcher July 4, 1986 Dallas. Western States Tag Team, as Akiyomoto with Akiyo Sato won belts June 1979, lost to Reno 2 Fuli and Adi Tago July 21, 1979 Amarillo. Beat the Champ California TV title, as Takachio defeated Great Goliath December 9, 1970 Los Angeles, lost to Great Goliath December 18, 1970 Los Angeles. Central States Tag Team, as Takachio with Pac Song defeated Bulldog Bob Brown and Dick Murdoch April 17, 1980 in Kansas City, lost to Bulldog Bob Brown and Pat O'Connor June 18, 1980 in Des Moines, Iowa, with Killer Carl Cox defeated Bulldog Bob Brown and Pat O'Connor June 21, 1980 in Kansas City, lost to Bulldog Bob Brown and Rufus Jones August 14, 1980 Kansas City. There are a lot of interesting goings-on from a television front over the past week in Japan. Kazuyoshi Ishii of K1 announced on September 7 that the October 28 K1 show from Tokyo Yoyogi Gym would be broadcast on Nippon TV, and that future K1 events on January 17, 1999 and March 22, 1999 would also air on Nippon TV. K1 also has a contract that expires in December with the Fuji Network, which will still broadcast the September 27 Osaka Dome and December 13 Tokyo Dome shows. As things now stand, the 3 shows on Nippon TV would be all Japanese shows so that none of the big-name international drawing cards would be doing the shows, and the whole idea of the shows would be to expose and hopefully create Japanese drawing cards for K1 since the biggest Japanese draw in the group, Masaaki Sadake, is clearly on his last legs. Last year's Tokyo Dome show drew better than a 20 rating in prime time. In addition, as a concession of trying to get the K1 contract full-time next year, Nippon TV is giving Ishii a 30-minute weekly promotion show every Monday night from 1:45 to 2:15 a.m. starting on October 5 to promote his cards and angles. What this means for the Fuji Network's SRS show is unclear. SRS had been a 30-minute weekly digest airing late Wednesday nights, which did exceedingly strong ratings, in the 4.0 to 5.0 range, covering the martial arts scene in Japan, with K1 the primary focus but also covering the major Valley Tudo and karate shows. SRS up until a few months ago also gave heavy coverage to Pancrase, although they never even acknowledged the existence of any other pro wrestling promotion including rings, although Pancrase has split with SRS. But K1 was the main draw of the show, which heavily promoted the events, since that promotion also drove the TV ratings for Fuji's big show broadcasts. K1 also announced the bracketing for the World Grand Prix Tournament first-round matches at the Osaka Dome. The bracketing has Francisco Filio vs. Rick Rufus, Maurice Smith vs. Mike Bernardo, Sadake vs. Graub Vitoza, Shinisi Andresevic, Croatia, vs. Peter Aerts, Ernest Hoost vs. Tasuka the King of Sting, Australia, Matt Skelton vs. Sam Greco, Ray Sefo vs. Stefan Liko and Mark Lassell, England vs. Andy Hoke. The 8 winners then face off at the Tokyo Dome show in a one-night tournament which would figure to be Filio vs. Bernardo, Sadake vs. Aerts, Hoost vs. Greco and Hug vs. either Sefo or Liko in first-round matches, and continuing from there. Antonio Inoki, Satoru Sayama and Naoya Ogawa held a press conference on September 8 in Tokyo at the Keio Plaza Hotel, location noteworthy because of the hotel's longtime affiliation with New Japan dating back to the 70s, to not only announce the debut show of the new UFO promotion on October 24 at the Tokyo Yoyogi Gym, the same site that K1 has also been running. In addition, October 24 is the same night New Japan Ha, a major show in Fukuoka, so none of the top-name New Japan talent will be available to UFO. The group announced that TBS, which is Channel 8 in Tokyo and not related to TBS in the United States, will broadcast the debut show later that evening on a tape delay. The card will consist of 8 singles matches with rules similar to UFC or Valley Tudo, with fighters wearing gloves and punches to the head while standing being legal, although the assumption with the group built around Ogawa and produced by Inoki is that it'll be largely if not completely worked. TBS will become the regular carrier of UFO broadcasts, as with the huge ratings that K1 pulls in, Other stations are attempting to broadcast major league martial arts events. The television deal gives UFO some credibility and is interesting because UFO is really just a worked angle to create a promotion to eventually build two interpromotional matches with New Japan to try and turn Ogawa into a major pro wrestling drawing card as he continues to beat martial artists from around the world. However, they've gone so far as their created promotion being on a rival television station. Ogawa's opponent on the first show is billed as an American named Gun McGee, or something close to that, who is billed as being 7'2½". Kazunari Murakami will be positioned as the number 2 star for UFO. Murakami is a Japanese fighter who fought twice in the old EFC in the United States, first beating Bart Vale and then losing in a heavyweight title challenge to Maurice Smith with probably the single most devastating knockout punch in the history of MMA. Pancrase is attempting to position itself to where either Fuji or Nippon TV, whichever one doesn't get the K1 deal in 1999, to pick up their major events next year which, if that pulls off, would change the entire business in Japan. Right now, when it comes to network exposure in Japan, Fuji has K1 and All Japan Women, whose stature has been elevated in recent weeks after drawing a big number in a late night time slot including a 5.9 peak rating well past midnight on a Sunday when the Shinobu Kondori vs Manami Toyota match aired recently. Nippon has the K1B shows and All Japan, TV Asahi has New Japan and TBS has UFO. Japanese television rundown. August 22, New Japan, 1. In the semi-finals of the G1 tournament, Kazuo Yamazaki beat Masahiro Chono in 9:43. This was a good match, particularly toward the finish as they crossed up each other's patented spots. Chono debuted a new one-man stuff piledriver. They did an interesting spot where Yamazaki voluntarily dropped to his back to grab a guard, but Chono crossed it up by grabbing the leg and turning him over into a half crab and getting a STF from there. At another point Yamazaki was behind Chono and Chono went for his backward low blow, but Yamazaki caught the leg and put on an ankle lock, but Chono made the ropes. Chono finally hit the low blow and followed with a tail lock, but Yamazaki made the ropes. Finish saw Chono go for the Yakuza kick, but Yamazaki caught the leg into an ankle lock for the submission. Of course the place went nuts for the upset. 3¼ stars. 2. Shinya Hashimoto beat Satoshi Kojima in 13:51 in the other semi-final. Only the second half of the match aired, but based on what aired it was an excellent match. Crowd was going nuts and both guys, who were probably the two best heavyweights in the company, were at their best. At one point Kojima came off the top rope with an elbow to Hashimoto's bad knee and set up the figure 4, but Hashimoto made the ropes. Kojima got a near fall with a lariat as Hashimoto was almost immobile due to the knee damage. Big pop. They then did the spots where Kojima kept hitting lariats but Hashimoto refused to go down. Finally, as Kojima went for a third or fourth one, Hashimoto gave him a hard chop across the bicep of the lariat arm and Kojima sold the arm big. At this point it became immobile Hashimoto throwing kicks with his bad leg and selling himself, and injured Kojima throwing lariats with his bad arm and selling. Finally Hashimoto chopped the hell out of Kojima's lariat arm and hit a stiff drop kick. Hashimoto then destroyed Kojima with brutal chops and kicks before hitting a DDT, and Kojima kicked out. Kojima kicked out of a second DDT. Finally, after a third DDT, Hashimoto locked his lariat arm into an armbar submission and the ref called for the bell. 4 stars. 3. Hashimoto beat Yamazaki in 15:34 to win the G1 tournament. Yet another excellent match and a fitting climax to the best series of shows of the year. The only negative to this match is that the first 2/3 of the match were the two guys beating the hell out of each other with chops and kicks, which was the same match as Hashimoto had in the main event the previous night against Genichiro Tenryu. Because it was so similar, even though this was even stiffer, and because Tenryu is a bigger star than Yamazaki, the crowd reactions to the brutal part of the match were nowhere close to the night before. Yamazaki mainly worked on Hashimoto's bad knee while Hashimoto continued to destroy Yamazaki with the stiffest punches and kicks you'll ever see. Yamazaki made comebacks with kick after kick to the bad knee, before finally taking the match up another notch after a dragon screw. Hashimoto rolled to the floor after the move and Yamazaki nailed him with a pescado, which has to be a first for a UWFI-style worker. Yamazaki continued to work on the knee including wrapping it around the post. After another dragon screw, Yamazaki put in knee-lock submission. Hashimoto came back with the big chops but Yamazaki reversed and attempted his DDT into a sleeper in the middle, but Hashimoto made the ropes. After trading kicks, Yamazaki got the ankle lock but Hashimoto made the ropes. Hashimoto finally hit the brainbuster for the pin. 4¼ stars. August 29, New Japan. This was taped on August 8 at the Osaka Dome. 1. Kensuke Sasaki beat Don Frye via DQ in 9:04. There was a lot of heat early. Frye mainly did subtle heel tactics like eye gouging, refusing to break on the ropes, and even once biting Sasaki in the thigh to escape from an armbar. When Frye hit his first low blow, the match pretty well fell apart. The ref had a cow about it, which made no sense since the low blow is a regular part of the Chono repertoire. Sasaki made a fiery comeback with a back suplex and a lariat, before Frye threw another low blow and was disqualified, which made things even worse since, as mentioned, Chono routinely does them, and New Japan never does DQ finishes. The pull-apart brawl after the match was pretty good and heated, particularly the brawling with Yuji Nagata and Brian Johnston. Sasaki had several different cuts on his head, one above his eye and one on the hairline, as apparently Frye got his money's worth in his fouls. 1/2 star. 2. Tenryu beat Hashimoto in 14-12 to retain the Japanese heavyweight title. The final 6:30 aired. Hashimoto was real good, but Tenryu couldn't pull out another miracle as he did in their previous meeting. Hashimoto got a lot of near falls using his big moves. Tenryu came back with slow Enzui-Jiri and lariats, with Hashimoto surviving 3 Enzui-Jiri and 4 lariats, and a 4th Enzui-Jiri and a war special submission. Tenryu basically power-bombed him out of nowhere for something of an anticlimactic finish. 3 stars. 3. Chono beat Tatsumi Fujinami in 1953 to win the IWGP Heavyweight title. Boring match, even worse for it being a big show main event and a world title change. Fujinami's title reign really was a flop as he had no fire, and even against good opponents, his matches were dull. Him winning it on the Inoki retirement show made for a good story, but all his title matches were 70s pacing, but without the pickups a good 70s match would have. Chono used SDFs and Teo locks but couldn't get the submission, and his Yakuza kick before finally getting the win. 3/4 of a star. Puerto Rico. The anniversary show back on August 1 drew about 13,000 fans, which would be the largest WWC crowd in 2 years due to all the mainstream pub of it being the 25th anniversary of the promotion. Carlos Colon beat Ray Gonzalez to win the Universal title in the main event on that show, but Gonzalez regained the title on August 2 in Mayaguez. Depending upon how you formulate it, it was either Colon's 21st or 23rd title reign, and Gonzalez's win was his 5th. Eddie Jackie, who had been wrestling here as Perfect 10, has due to a lack of charisma been given a mask and is now the enforcer doing a lot of no-sell spots. Invader No. 1 returned on August 15 to feud with Gonzalez over the title. Invader blew out his knee on July 18, which was 10 years to the day of the murder of Bruiser Brody. El Rockero won the WWC Junior Heavyweight title from Jerry Estrada on August 15 in Caguas. Estrada is working on a blown-out right elbow. Mexico. EMLL announced that in honor of its 65th anniversary, they would be doing 3 major shows over the next 3 Fridays, although the September 18th with the El Hijo del Santo vs. Scorpio Jr. Mask vs. Mask match and Universo 2000 vs. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. CMLL World Heavyweight title match is the big show. The reason they announced they would spread the anniversary deal out over 3 weeks is that they're really afraid about drawing on September 18th because of the De La Hoya vs. Chavez boxing match, since Chavez is a national hero in Mexico. Both EMLL and AAA, running a big show that night in Madero, both wish they had checked the calendar because both are worried the boxing match may greatly hurt the attendance. The September 11th show is loaded from a depth of name wrestlers standpoint, with a Mask vs. Mask match on top with Mr. Aguila vs. Ultimo Guerrero, El Boricua and Ricky Santana, and Kevin Quinn vs. Emilio Charles Jr. and Apollo Dantes and Mascara Año 2000 in a Puerto Rico vs. Mexico rematch. Santo and Villano Tercero and Fuerza Guerrera vs. Negro Casas and La Fiera and Atlantis and Headhunters and Ringo Mendoza vs. El Satanico and Cien Caras and Universo 2000. It's amazing to see Cien Caras in the second match on the card. In the main event, they've added the stipulation that if either man doesn't show up, they would also lose their mask. They really emphasize that stip because many fans know that Ultimo Guerrero last year quit Promo Azteca right before he was supposed to lose his mask. AAA is countering on September 18 in Madero with a card called Summer Scandal 98 in Madero. Nothing has been announced for the show other than a women's hair match, which has been changed to a Parejas Increíbles, Incredible Partners, match with Xochitl Hamada teaming with one of the Moreno sisters against the other Moreno sister and Miss Jennifer. What looks to be the top draw on the card is another famous actor, Carlos Benavides, who is friends with Guicho Dominguez, the other actor involved in the current AAA storylines and feuding with heel ref Tirantes, challenging Tirantes to pick a wrestler of his choice, and he's pick a wrestler, and Benavides would put his hair up against Tirantes' hair. Benavides said he'd be happy to second either Octagon, Heavy Metal or Blue Demon Jr. against Kickboxer, but Tirantes responded by challenging Dominguez to put up his own hair instead. At the August 16 TV tapings, Dominguez hit Tirantes with a chair as he was doing his heel ref gimmick. Box E Lucha ripped on veteran Kato Kung Lee Sr., who lost 7 straight hair matches in border cities from August 8 to August 14, getting part of his hair cut every night until finally being bald at the end of the week. Juventud Guerrera and his new wife were in attendance on August 28 at Arena Mexico for his father's return to EMLL. They are pushing an angle, probably leading to something, where they mention that Arena Mexico is still the cathedral for pro wrestling in Mexico, and that Guerrera, Rey Mysterio Jr., La Parca and Psicosis have never wrestled in that building. On the September 4 Arena Mexico show, the main event saw Team Mexico of Charles Jr. and Mascara Año 2000 and Dantes get destroyed in a terrible beating from Team Puerto Rico of Quinn and Boricua and Santana, with the Puerto Rican team disqualified in 2 straight falls, and leaving the Mexicans laying to set up this week's rematch. The semi saw Santo and Fuerza Guerrera and Villano Tercero beat Casas and Felino and Shocker, although for the second week in a row, they teased problems with Santo and Guerrera, who have feuded on and off for the past 10 years and worked together in the ring so smoothly they were almost born to work against each other. The commissioners at the show, and also on September 6 at Arena Coliseo, heavily enforced the rules, and whenever wrestlers started brawling outside the ring, the commission ordered them to get back in the ring. Ringo Mendoza, 48, beat El Signo in a hair versus hair match on September 6 at Arena Coliseo. They were billing the match as Mendoza's 30th anniversary of turning pro, and it drew a big house. Panico Juan Manuel Mar has replaced Jose Pianono Medina as the matchmaker for EMLL. Some talk of Phil LaFon and Mike Lazansky heading to EMLL as a Canadian tag team. Only problem is with the economy the way it is, how can they make any money working there? Although it has been reported elsewhere that Pirata Morgan sold the IWC heavyweight title to Super Delphin in Japan, he actually lose the title on August 14 in Isabel to La Parca. Radamés Coco's second show at the 30,000-seat Palacio de los Deportes in Mexico City for pay-per-view, and his Ocesa promotion will be on October 24. Super Luchas really blasted both Mr. Aguila and Villano 4 for appearing on American television without their masks, without losing them in a masked match and violating Mexican honor and tradition. They also congratulated Rey Mysterio Jr. and Pantera for standing up to the pressure of American promoters and not taking off their masks when asked. The September 6 IWRG show in Naucalpan had a Japan vs. Mexico 12-man match for what was billed as the 4th annual High Power Cup, with Pantera and Shocker and Mr. Niebla and Starboy and Solar and Miki Segura representing Mexico, and Magnum Tokyo and Shima Nobunaga and Yoshihiro Tajiri and Saito and Kanda and Sumo Fuji representing Japan, ending when Niebla made Tokyo submit to a Boston Crab. Former wrestler and referee Babe Richard, in what apparently is not an angle, attacked a Box E Lucha writer named Javier Munoz, as in the September 8 newspaper. Dr. Alfonso Morales brought up the story, which had gotten no TV pub, and said that Richard should be arrested. El Satanico defends the CMLL middleweight belt against La Fiera on September 13 in Nezahualcóyotl. All Japan. In a big surprise, Mitsuharu Misawa announced that Yoshinari Ogawa and not Manukiya Mossman would become his new regular tag team partner, including at the tournament, which explains Ogawa scoring 2 pinfalls in tag matches of late against Jun Akiyama. The news generally was given a negative reaction, since Ogawa has been around forever and nobody takes him seriously as a top guy as compared with Mossman, who is only 22 years old and has seen a rising potential superstar. From a depth standpoint, the September 11 Budokan Hall show looks much stronger than usual, with Kenta Kobashi, who has gained a lot of weight of late, probably due to his knee problems, making cardio training impossible as he looks to be around 280, and that isn't good, versus Akira Tao for the Triple Crown, Toshiaki Kawada versus Masahito Kakihara, Misawa versus Mossman, Akiyama versus Ogawa, San Hansen and Bobby Duncombe Jr. versus Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama, Giant Baba and Jumbo Tsuruta and Rusher Kimura versus Haruka Eigen and Masa Fuchi and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, Takao Mori and Tamon Honda and Jun Nizamida versus Johnny Ace and Wolf Hockfield and Johnny Smith, Geto and Jado versus Mark Rajan and Giant Kimala 2 and Mitsuo Momono and Masao Inoue and Yoshinobu Kanemaru versus Masamichi Marufuji and Kentaro Shiga and Satoru Asako. Marufuji, who turns 18 in 2 weeks, made his pro debut on August 28 in Okazaki and has been getting rave reviews, doing all sorts of hot moves. He started training in April after graduating high school and going all the way to the high school national championships at 165 pounds. Next series is October 3rd to October 31st with major shows on October 3rd in Kawasaki, October 4th at Korakuen Hall, October 6th in Niigata, October 11th in Nagoya at Aichi Gym, October 12th in Osaka at Chuo Gymnasium, which would be the first time All Japan has booked a show in that building, October 24th at Korakuen Hall and October 31st at Budokan Hall. On September 5th in Toyama, Smith and Hockfield retained the All-Asian Tag titles beating Izumata and Kimura in 22-15, when Hockfield pinned 2 after a splash off the top. Jinsei Shinzaki came in for the September 3rd show in Tokushima, which is his hometown, teaming with Baba and Mossman to beat Misawa and Amori and Asako when Shinzaki using his praying powerbomb on Asako. It is believed Shinzaki is going to work the entire October All Japan tour. Shinzaki said he wanted to team with Baba in his hometown, so Baba removed himself from the comedy match since he considered Baba as the god of pro wrestling. Mossman lost his singles match to Kobashi on September 6 in Kyoto before a sellout of 2,450 in Kobashi's hometown, but did beat Hockfield. August 23 TV did a 3.2 rating. New Japan. Things are still quiet with the new tour opening on September 10. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono returned from Taiwan. August 22 TV did a 1.2 rating with the time slot moved way back. Other Japan notes. Yoji Anjo suffered a broken right leg in his K1 match against Masaaki Sadake on August 28 and will be out of action for the rest of the year. The full promotion is running another show on September 11 in Kawasaki with Dos Caras, El Cico Delico Jr., Giant Dos Caras, Kenji Takano, Negro Casas, Pierre Roth Jr., Tarzan Boy, Dancing Danny, Super Crazy, Mosco de la Merced, Dos Caras de la Muerte Renegade, not WCW wrestler, and Gran Hamada. Urgent will be holding a tournament to crown the first Queen Origin World title, a knockoff of the King of Pancrase title, starting October 7 with the finals at Korakuen Hall on December 7. September 23 in Sasebo will be a double mask vs. mask match with Great Sasuke and Tiger Mask vs. Sasuke the Great, Masao Orihara, and Masked Tiger, Takeshi Ono. The September 4 IWA show at Yokohama Bunka Gym drew a reported 2,618 with Great Kabuki and Gran Hamada over Great Sasuke and Terry Funk when Kabuki pinned Sasuke after blowing the green mist in his eyes in 1920. Keisuke Yamada pinned Akinori Tsukioka and Shigeo Okamura on that show to win the right to be Kabuki's final singles match opponent. There was a report that Akira Maeda would be in Nobuhiko Takada's corner on October 11 at the Tokyo Dome for his match with Hickson Gracie, which would be a great pro wrestling story, since they started out as brothers, became bitter promotional rivals, and it would make a good story for them to mend fences as both men's careers are ending. Particularly Maeda coaching Takada to become the first man to beat Gracie. But this isn't pro wrestling and you can't write good stories all the way through if the finish isn't predetermined. Anyway, I'm not sure if Maeda has ring shows in England and Georgia both on October 11th, or he has to go to both countries on that day to set up shows for next year, but since he'll be out of Japan, he can't be in Takada's corner. If Rings expands to those countries, it would actually become, with the exception of the WWF, as the most international of all wrestling promotions since it runs in Japan, Australia, Holland and Georgia, of the Soviet Republic. Already in England and Georgia would add 2 more countries. Chikako Shiratori and Yuki Lee quit JD to become free agents and Tomoko Kuzumi quit JWP to become a free agent, although that may be storylines to build up angles. FMW is also doing an angle where Atsushi Onita is threatening to quit the promotion after the next tour due to a difference of opinion with the rest of the wrestlers as to the direction the company is going. FMW legitimately is becoming more and more under the influence of Hiromichi Fuyuki, who has more of an Americanized mind toward wrestling as storytelling and gimmicks as opposed to sport, and FMW is now calling itself Entertainment Pro Wrestling. The original Mr. Pogo, who wrestles as Great Pogo for Big Japan, returned for an angle on September 3 in Tomakomai. After Haido and Yukihiro Kanemura and Koji Nakagawa beat Onita and Mr. Pogo and Yoshinori Sasaki in the main event, Great Pogo threw a fireball at Mr. Pogo. Pogo is still working for Big Japan and hasn't done anything with FMW since that show. The Road Warriors will make their return to Japan after several years away on the Battlers' November 23 Sumo Hall show facing Jinsei Shinzaki and Daisuke Ikeda. Warriors were huge draws in Japan during the 80s and early 90s. The Battlers' Young Generation tournament ended with afternoon and evening shows at FM Hall, a 300-seat gym in Tokyo with Yuki Ishikawa beating Victor Kruger in the finals after beating Minoru Tanaka in the semifinals. Carl Greco was also in the Final Four, but apparently was injured, as Kruger beat him in only 48 seconds and he forfeited the third-place match to Tanaka. Jason the Terrible and GK Kamikaze from Wrestle Dream Factory and GK Jr., Minoru Fujita, became Big Japan's first six-man tag champs, winning the tourney finals on September 6 in Nagoya over Isao Takagi and Tomoaki Honma and Ichigo. On that show, ancient promoter Shinya Kojika wrestled under the name Kung Fu Lee, which is the ring name he used in the early 70s in the Amarillo territory, where he feuded with Terry Funk over the Western States Championship. Former national women's judo champion Junko Yagi had her first main event on September 1 in Tokyo, teaming with Shinobu Kondori on the LLPW show against Carl Midori and Harley Saito, which ended in a no contest. LLPW is running its biggest show in its history on October 10 at Sumo Hall, billed as a women's L1 UFC-style show in the Octagon, apparently figuring to draw the out-of-towners who are coming in already for the Gracie Takada match the next day at the Tokyo Dome. Besides Svetlana Gundarenko, who won the L1 tournament in 1995, versus Kondori main event, it'll be Yumiko Hata versus Angel Amoroso, former ECW valet, Linus Asuka against Irma Haroff from Holland, Yagi versus Frau Holman from Holland, and a few more matches. Becky Levi has been talked with about being on the show as well. What I can say is that the women that have been contacted have been told these matches are shoots and not works. Levi, if she does well and makes a name for herself to wrestling fans on this show, is interested in doing pro wrestling matches against Kyoko Inoue or other top Japanese women. There is a dispute between Inoue's Neo Ladies and Jimmy Suzuki, the agent for Nicole Bass, who claims Neo Ladies owes Bass $500 more as a bonus that he paid her out of pocket and expenses while in Japan that total $1,500. Neo Ladies paid Bass $3,000 plus $500 as a bonus for the weekend. If Neo Ladies doesn't come up with the money, he is going to try and sell Bass to Michinoku Pro for a singles match against Great Sasuke or to LLPW for a match with Kondori. Here and there. The current issue of Surfer magazine reported that Sammy Steamboat Mokuahi died recently in Honolulu. Sammy Steamboat was a big-name wrestler in the Southeast during the 60s as Eddie Graham's tag team partner in Florida and also a top star in the Carolinas and many other territories. He wrestled through the 70s for Ed Francis Honolulu promotion before retiring and working on Waikiki Beach, renting surfboards and the like to tourists, and was considered a fixture among the surfers at the beach for 40 years. Ricky Steamboat, whose real name was Richard Blood, was given the Steamboat ring name as the original idea when he started getting his push was to create a new Sammy Steamboat type of top babyface, although as it turned out Ricky greatly outshined Sammy as a wrestling star. Ricky was billed for a time as both Sammy's son and nephew, although there was no relationship. Japanese records list Steamboat as 58 years old, although that sounds young. This week's Memphis TV saw a Jerry Lawler versus Billy Travis match where if Lawler won, Randy Hales would have to get in a small cage for the rest of the show, but if Travis won, then Stacy would have to get in the cage. Lawler won by DQ and ref Aubrey Wayne found the chain Hales had given Travis to get the pin and reversed the decision, so Hales spent the rest of the show in the cage. Ashley Hudson either lost a loser leaves town match or was suspended for 30 days, so has shown up under a mask as the Australian sensation. Brandon Baxter did an interview saying Stacy was coming on to him and told her to drop Lawler. She wound up kneeing him in the groin. It appears that Dave Brown is legitimately upset with the direction of modern wrestling and doesn't seem comfortable broadcasting these type of angles. Late in the show, Lawler put the cage Hales was in on a dolly and kept spinning it around, makes Hales dizzy. Somehow the cage door was opened and it wound up with Baxter and Stacy in the cage and Baxter groping all over her. Memphis ran 3 free shows at the Sun Dome as part of a Labor Day special from September 5th to September 7th, drawing between 1,500 and 2,500. Leigh Thatcher will be promoting the second annual Brian Pillman Memorial Show in Cincinnati on April 28, 1999 at the Cincinnati Gardens 2,000-seat annex with the cooperation of the WWF. Bruce Mitchell of the Observer Hotline will be doing a weekly phone-in wrestling show on WIP at 9:50 a.m., out of Greensboro at 6 p.m. on Tuesdays. Music City Wrestling's first anniversary show will be October 3rd in Nashville with Rock and Roll Express and Al Snow appearing. Burt Prentice is telling people that he'll be getting completely out of the wrestling business once the company totally transfers to Bill Barron's over the next few months. Jake Roberts appears October 10th for Intercontinental Pro Wrestling in Russellville, Arkansas. MMA Mark Coleman has pulled out of the October 16th UFC Brazil show, although in his case it is being said that it's not monetary, but because of health problems that don't allow him to train properly. At press time, the show looks to be Vitor Belfort versus Jerry Bolander, Frank Shamrock vs. John LeBay for the middleweight title, and Mikey Burnett vs. Pat Miletic to create a lightweight champion as the top matches, and there will be 4 other matches. Among those being talked about at least somewhat seriously are Tsuyoshi Kosaka vs. Pete Williams, Tank Abbott vs. Pedro Rizzo, Wanderlei da Silva vs. Jeremy Horn, and Pele vs. Chuck Liddell. Alexander Otska, a small pro wrestler, like about 180 pounds, with the Battle Arts promotion, will be Marco Ruas' opponent on the October 11th KRS Tokyo Dome show. The date of the Draka pay-per-view, which will be available nationwide, is September 25th. It's amazing that Viewers' Choice and the cable companies will air a product which had a death on its 3rd show, sift fighters on payoffs, and from a purely business standpoint, can't make any money because nobody is going to buy it, but won't air UFC. It appears if UFC is going to survive in whatever limited fashion, it'll be largely as an event for Brazilian television co-promoted by a Brazilian network. Semaphore Entertainment Group is severely downsizing, and David Isaacs isn't the only major executive in the company that isn't with the company. Super Brawl 9, entitled Brawl at the Border, on September 19th from El Paso, Texas, headlined by Dan Severn, will air on TV Azteca throughout Mexico on September 26th. Vladimir Matyushenko dominated Joe Pardo over 3 5-minute rounds to win a decision in the main event of a Pancrase Rules show on September 5th in Reno, Nevada. Bob Cook of Frank Shamrock's Team USA won the lightweight tournament, including winning his first-round match in 4 seconds. ECW, as it turns out, ECW is on WATL-TV in Atlanta at 1 a.m. Saturday night, being moved to 1 a.m. Friday on September 25th, time slot. The confusion with the programmers is that ECW is paid programming on the station. There were a lot of injuries over the past week, both in and out of the ring. Bill Alfonso suffered a broken forearm delivering a shot to either sign Guy Dudley or Joel Gertner in Chalmette, Louisiana, and worked Thibodeau on September 6th with his arm in a sling. He's supposed to have pins put in this week and will probably be back working on September 12th. Axel Rotten was in bad shape over the weekend with a liver inflammation and was hospitalized in Louisiana and had gallbladder surgery. He was expected to return home by the end of the week and will probably be out around 1 month. Shane Douglas' sinuses exploded again and was hospitalized in Louisiana but was fine by September 8th. Paul Heyman suffered a scratched cornea in his sleep, apparently from scratching his eye due to allergies acting up, and had laser surgery and was wearing a patch on his eye for a day or 2. Bam Bam Bigelow, a broken wrist, apparently collapsing and landing badly while getting out of his car due to dizzy spells, which may have been a complication from a recent concussion at the August 29th match with Masato Tanaka from a brain-jarring chair shot. He's expected out for about 2 weeks. Justin Credible and Joel Gertner are both expected to be off this coming weekend since Credible is getting married and Gertner is in the wedding. Mike Awesome actually suffered a broken ankle in Japan and will probably be back, at least to do an angle to set up the pay-per-view on the October 10th ECW Arena show, and is expected to be working the pay-per-view show. If he's not ready, there is a chance Terry Funk would be used in the spot planned for him. The word is also that the pay-per-view may not be held at the Downtown Municipal Auditorium in New Orleans, as apparently they didn't like the results of a site survey over the weekend. They are attempting to move the show to the Uno Lakefront Arena, which is the 8,700-seat building that the WWF is running on September 19th. ECW sold 1,400 tickets for $50,000 on the first day they were put on sale for New Orleans. The 4 shows this past week were September 3rd in Alexandria, Louisiana, drawing only 150, although the show was entertaining. September 4th in Baton Rouge drew about 850. September 5th in Chalmette, Louisiana for TV drew 1,400 for what was said to be the best ECW show since the pay-per-view, and September 6th in Thibodaux, Louisiana drew 891. The highlight of the week was said to be a Masato Tanaka vs. Balls Mahoney match in Chalmette and was said to be even better than their ECW arena match. The only newcomers in were Rod Price, who looked somewhere between bad and average, although Paul Heyman was high on him and he will be brought in for more dates, and One Man Gang, who put Spike Dudley over in 10 seconds matches the last 2 nights of the tour to huge pops since they are positioning Dudley as the ultimate giant killer. Gang was probably only in to put Dudley over. On the TV, taped at the ECW Arena on August 29th, they aired Chris Candido vs. Lance Storm. The wrestling was great and the brawling was bad, and they lost it whenever they went with the brawling. All the stuff with the women worked since the former Dawn Marie, now Tammy Lynn bitch, has good facials and Tammy Sitch is really over. The built up to tons of underwear shots, including the new girl in her bra and panties and Storm picking Sitch up for a suplex, and the combination of gravity and short dresses gave the requisite panty shot. Unfortunately, we had to see Candido in these leopard thong briefs in front of a crowd of about 1,500 almost exclusively guys. Sal E. Graziano gets incredible heat for someone who has been in the ring for only a few weeks. He squashed Cronus, who is still around but just jobbing, in 39 seconds and then lost to Spike after a marathon 13 seconds. Tracy Smothers beat Tommy Rogers in a good short match. Rogers has the rep for being a good worker, but it's been so long most people have forgotten just how good he is, and Smothers is one of the most underrated performers in the country. Finally, Sandman beat Jason and Justin Credible. Crowd was hot early. Credible barely worked except for quick double team spots. Jason didn't look that bad, but Sandman more than made up for it. It was kept to 5 minutes, so it wasn't too bad. The TV has generally been a step improved over the past several weeks. Tanaka will miss this weekend's shows as a planned trip back home to Japan but will return for the following weekend. The idea of doing the explosive match with Atsushi Onita seems to be postponed until the spring. Nothing is definite, but the original plan for September obviously isn't going to happen. ECW has been talked with by FMW about bringing a crew in from December 10th to December 12th for 3 dates at Korakuen Hall, one of which will be a Japanese pay-per-view show. The ECW CD is scheduled for release on October 27th. WCW. The situation with Ric Flair is that he will debut on September 14th in Greenville, South Carolina, unless the decision is made to bring him out as a surprise on the pay-per-view from Winston-Salem. At press time, Flair has not dropped his lawsuit against WCW trying to get out of his contract, nor has WCW dropped its lawsuit against Flair. Theoretically, Flair could work for WCW, get a ruling in his favor, and immediately as a free agent go to WWF, although I believe that is more theoretical legally than a possibility of something that is going to happen. WWF sources claim the company was very interested, but due to the question of tampering, particularly with its own lawsuit out against WCW, the idea of specifically laying out scenarios and offering contracts to wrestlers under contract to the opposition wasn't done. While they were not the deciding factor, it is said that comments by Undertaker and to a much lesser extent Hunter Hearst Helmsley regarding him being too old did play a part in Flair's decision. It has been reported that WCW wasn't paying Flair while this case had been going on, but that is technically incorrect, as failure to send a payment would have resulted in a contract breach and then he would have been a free agent. Eric Bischoff talked about Flair on September 5th on a Baltimore wrestling talk show, and some of this has to be taken as working an angle since no doubt Flair and Bischoff will be doing an angle upon his return, but this is what he said regarding the lawsuit. Mike Mooneyham of the Charleston Post-Courier and Wrestling Observer Hotline, in response to an article about the situation favorable to Flair, doesn't know the whole story. He doesn't know the fact that Ric Flair had agreed that any time that Ric Flair ever wanted any time off, that request would come in writing so that we would have the opportunity to schedule his time off accordingly. His agents are being deposed next week and will testify to that. Ric Flair took time off that he never asked for, that he wasn't scheduled for, and put WCW in a bind. I had to make a decision. I had to draw a line and say, okay, am I going to let Ric Flair get away with this so that other 130 people that I have under contract realize that any time they don't want to show up for a show they can just basically stick it to WCW and no show? Or do I draw a line and make people realize that there's policies, there's procedures, there's agreements, and this is a business and we have to act professionally and responsibly? And I drew the line on Ric Flair because Ric Flair, in my opinion and according to his agreement and the agreement that we had with his agents, acted unprofessionally and irresponsibly, and I had to draw the line, and it's unfortunate because Rick was a big name talent and he's a guy that could have continued to contribute, but unfortunately, we're just not seeing eye to eye with regard to that subject. Nitro on September 7th in Pensacola, Florida drew a sellout 6,379, paying $126,265. The brains behind the writing of Nitro at this point appear to be mainly Eric Bischoff, former child actor Jason Hervey, Bischoff's friend, as Hervey backing up Bischoff's claim to have ideas for TV shows in production years ago was largely why Bill Shaw hired him to head WCW, as Shaw was looking for a TV person to run the company after wrestling people had proven inept at running a modern business, Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash. The show remains amazingly disorganized to the point where the show changes frequently while it is on the air. Anyway, show opened with Warrior graffiti in Hogan's locker room and Scott Norton and Bryan Adams supposedly laid out and being taken to the hospital in an ambulance, which must have been driving them to Narita Airport in Japan since they're working there through September 23rd. Hogan said that either Disciple or Giant would lay out Warrior before the end of the show and challenged him to show up. Hogan then said that Bret Hart would be replaced by Giant in War Games. However, later in the show J.J. Dillon said it was Hart's name on the contract, so it would be Hart in War Games. Conan beat Bull Payne in 2:49 with the Tequila Sunrise. Conan's rap got a big reaction. DDP came out and brought up joining the Wolfpack and basically acted like he wouldn't. Sting, Luger, and Nash all came out. Page said he didn't think Sting could trust Nash. Fans reacted to Page as the heel when he was confronting Wolfpack. Sting challenged Page to a tag match later in the show and to pick Roddy Piper as his partner. Page asked for Nash to be Sting's partner, and when Page cut a promo on Nash, he was booed again. The original plan at this point was for Sting and Nash to be a team in the main event, but as the show went on, the angle was changed where Nash would interfere in the finish but Luger would do the match. Piper did an interview reminiscent of someone babbling on but totally out of touch. He said he didn't like being put in that position but agreed he's team with Page on the show, but said War Games wasn't about teams, it was every man for himself to get a shot at Goldberg. Wrath beat Lenny Lane with a meltdown in 2:27. Wrath has an amazingly small waist for someone so huge. They found Ed Leslie in the locker room hung upside down asleep from the ceiling like he was Grandpa Munster sleeping. Hey, I know it's outdated but I don't know anyone else who sleeps like that. Hart came out to no music and little fanfare but mostly booze. He was surrounded by Vincent, Curt Hennig, and Stevie Ray. Sting came out and the NWO guys left. Bret went to high-five Sting and Sting wouldn't do it. He then gave Bret the bat and turned his back. Bret didn't hit him and threw down the bat. Fans still didn't cheer him. They aired a Neil Pruitt special interview package with Rick Steiner, which was the best interview Steiner has ever done. Scott Steiner, who took no bumps and did no moves, destroyed Evan Karagi's new spelling, same green wrestler, in 145 with the Steiner recliner. Juventud Guerrera retained the Cruiserweight title beating Hector Garza in 6:49 with the Juvie driver. Guerrero looked great. Garza looked hesitant in his first U.S. match back from reconstructive knee surgery. Actually, Garza is supposed to be out for another 2 months, but WCW found out that he's already worked a few matches in Mexico and ordered him in. Still, it was far and away the best match on this show. Ernest Miller beat Kenny Chaos with a high kick in 3:07. Miller attempted another interview and challenged anyone in the company to come out. Fans chanted for Goldberg. Nobody came out. Chaos nearly killed himself trying a springboard lariat. Boring. Stevie Ray beat Chris Adams with a slapjack in 3:53. Stevie's got to drop the new white NWO outfit. It makes him look 6 months pregnant. Unless, of course, he is, in which case, he should be on maternity leave anyway. Perry Saturn beat Scotty Riggs in 4:28 with the Death Valley driver. Raven told Lodi to tell Saturn to break Riggs' fingers. He refused to, so Raven said either he breaks Riggs' fingers or Raven gets to break his fingers. So he let Raven break his fingers and then Saturn nearly attacked the trainer trying to attend to him, which makes perfect sense. I know if I just got my fingers broken, the first thing I'd do is attack every doctor in sight that wants to help fix me up. Chris Jericho beat Jim Neidhart in a TV title defense in 4:42. I can't even begin to explain what happened. Obviously in some drug-induced stupor they thought recreating the Bret Hart Montreal finish where Neidhart doesn't give up but the ref stops the match makes for a good finish. I've seen it on indie shows and said it already. That finish sucks, and it did again. Eddie Guerrero did another shoot interview that nobody cared about, claiming he was injured and his back was out and needed an MRI so he couldn't wrestle. I guess this was a spoof on the Scott Hall situation because so many wrestlers in WCW are out of action claiming injuries, some of which probably aren't hurt as bad as they claim. Dean Malenko beat Curt Hennig via DQ in a cage match in 12:17. After a ref bump, Malenko got the cloverleaf on and Bischoff ran down and unlocked the door, allowing Rick Rude and Ray to run in and destroy Malenko. They were about to slam the door on Malenko's head when Arn Anderson did a run-in, clocking both Hennig and Rude and staring down Ray. The Anderson run-in was easily the biggest pop and best thing on the show. The scary part is I'm afraid that means he'll probably wrestle again. From what we understand, he's improved to the point he can do things physically and badly wants to wrestle again. The problem is that even though he'd be a bigger star initially now than he ever was in his prime for reasons that are hard to explain but true nonetheless, there's something about a guy who got over by being a great worker reduced to being a limited performer physically that others have to carry. Cage match itself was boring, although Malenko's comebacks got heat, but Hennig didn't build heat with his offense. Goldberg pinned Scott Putski with a jackhammer in 52 seconds. More matches like that and the anti-Goldberg backlash will pile up a lot of momentum. Piper and Page beat Sting and Luger via DQ in 4:19 when Nash interfered and posted Piper and jackknifed Page. No reaction at all to Piper coming out. Page got a reaction coming through the crowd but again was booed once the match was on. Crowd didn't boo Piper, but didn't cheer him either and really didn't react much until the run-in. Sloppy brawl. Hogan and Giant came out for the finish. Hogan demanded Warrior face the Giant in the cage, which they lowered. The steam came flying, and when it cleared, Giant was asleep, Warrior was sitting in a chair in the ring, and Hogan ran away, although not before doing a sequence where Hogan missed a chair shot and Warrior hit Hogan with a chair shot that looked right out of a bad first day of wrestling school. Bischoff and the troops ran out, the steam came, and Warrior disappeared again. At least we don't have to match him wrestle or hear him talk, even if he's just doing last year's Sting gimmick. I got the impression the fans live were groaning at this finish because they know nobody really touched Giant. Granted, wrestling is a work, but that stuff is really fake. But the ultimate truth of today's wrestling is whatever draws ratings is good. For comparisons, the Nitro on August 24th that did the record 6.03 rating, the Florida State vs. Texas on Game on ABC did a 6.9 and the US Open on USA did a 1.3. Nitro also beat the CBS and Fox programming going head-to-head and double the UPN programming. Even without Raw, the demographics for Nitro really didn't change at all. All totaled up, there were 6,723,000 people in 4,495,000 homes watching an average minute of Nitro. There was a steady tune-out factor in the third hour which crossed almost all demographic lines except the teenage audience that actually peaked for the Hogan and Hart vs. Luger and Sting match, as it did a 5.8 rating among teenagers for that match as opposed to the 4.3 it had been doing over the previous month with Raw on and the 4.0 it averages for the year with teenagers. What that says basically is people realize the show sucked no matter what their age and sex, except for teenagers, who may have thought the show sucked and may not have, but they didn't turn the channel, and that's the WWF Stronghold audience. If you are looking at the audience that switched to Raw, you can compare the pre-NBA playoff numbers, when Nitro was winning every week, to the post-NBA playoff numbers, when Raw started winning, although Nitro has won the past 3 head-to-heads. In comparing those figures, Nitro is down 2% with males, up 5% with males 18 to 34, up 3% with males 18 to 49, down 3% of males 25 to 54, which actually means Nitro is up about 5% with the WWF's target group of 18 to 24 men, down 5% among women, down 9% among women 18 to 34, down 12% of women 18 to 49, down 8% among women 25 to 54, which means WCW is strongly down among women 18 to 24, although they still dominate that demo in a big way, down 3% among kids and down 14% among teens. WCW Thunder will start on TNT Europe and England on October 3rd every Saturday night or on a 2-day delay from its US broadcast. Nitro airs in England on Fridays. WCW nearly had a deal with Sky Box Office to air the pay-per-view shows in England, but it fell through since it would be a Turner company doing business with a Rupert Murdoch company, and the bigwigs had to nix the negotiations over that problem. Conan, Disco Inferno and Juventud Guerrera were all banged up on August 24th, taking bumps unknowingly on the part of the ring where the trapdoor was set up for Warrior's disappearing act. Conan worked all weekend in Nitro but was scheduled for an MRI this week. The others also worked all week at the house shows. Scott Steiner has 5 compressed discs in his back, and there is a lot of question as to how full a recovery he'll be able to make. It was clear from TV that he's nowhere close to being ready to work a singles match, so expect his match with Rick to be kept short. There was another drug test on August 31st, and it appears that all the top stars were drug tested. There had been talk of bringing Stevie Richards back. The one pushing for it was Terry Taylor, and since he's been demoted, that could hurt the chances. With Taylor and Kevin Sullivan losing some of their influence, the Meng push will probably die down, as they always thought more highly of him than others. The taped Thunder on September 3rd drew a 3.54 rating and a 6.18 share, which is neither good nor bad based on recent averages. Some corrections and clarifications on last week's report. Marty Jannetty actually beat Rick Fuller and not the other way around as we had reported. Kaz Hayashi vs. Lenny Lane was the best WCW TV match in a while. Raven vs. Meng wound up with Raven never touching Meng. Meng destroyed Sick Boy Horace and Riggs until Raven told Lodi to tell Saturn to fight him. Saturn tried fighting him until Canyon clocked Saturn and Meng destroyed him. This left Canyon against a weakened Saturn for what turned into a damn good match. Just as Saturn had turned things around, Lodi told Saturn he had to take the flatliner, which he did and got pinned. The Nitro in Phoenix on October 25th sold more than 10,000 tickets on the first day. The Den House show saw September 4th in Tupelo, Mississippi drew 7,243, 200 shy of a sellout, and $124,235. September 5th in Jackson, Mississippi drew a sellout 8,707 paying $194,115, and September 6th in Biloxi, Mississippi drew 8,109 paying $167,545. For those wondering exactly what these figures mean, it means that the total profit margin on these shows taking into account expenses for the week was in the $370,000 range. We sometimes get reaction from people both in and out of the industry thinking the WCW and WWF big gates are a result of overspending on advertising and thinking the grosses for WCW are a result of spending so much on advertising that the shows don't make money, when in fact the shows are tremendously profitable on their own. On shows that grossed a total of $612,160 for the week, the total advertising was $55,000. Merchandise for the week was $206,419 or $6.65 per head. What was amazing is these shows drew so well with such poor lineups on paper, and even poorer lineups delivered. There is one huge difference between WWF and WCW, and that's the attitude of the talent itself regarding house shows. Since virtually every name wrestler on the WWF roster works a full schedule of house shows, Undertaker and Austin are given time off, but they make up for it in doing more promotional work. It's considered a given. Most of the top names in WCW don't want to work house shows, which is why this weekend's lineups included the likes of High Voltage, Chris Adams, Brad Armstrong, Barry Darsow, etc., and the main events, which were all scheduled as Sting vs. Scott Hall, wound up as Conan and Sting vs. Bryan Adams and Scott Norton both nights. We did hear that Jericho and Guerrero tore the house down most nights, and that Conan was doing a lot of DX mannerisms, including "I've got 2 words for you," and everyone screams "suck it," along with his regular Nitro shtick. Hall missed the shows due to neck and hand injuries from the weight falling on him, which almost nobody believes, but I've been told on good authority that this one is legit. Hall actually may have been ready to wrestle on the September 7th Nitro, but the feeling was since he wasn't booked on the pay-per-view, they'd give him another week off. There was some talk he might be added to the pay-per-view, but it doesn't look that way, although at press time nothing official has been announced as a pay-per-view undercard. The lineup listed here last week, and that has gone around as official ever since, was only a tentative plan as of press time last week. We don't know anything different other than neither Conan nor Chris Jericho were ever told they were wrestling each other, and that Juventud Guerrera is under the impression he's defending his title against Silver King, which actually should be a great match if they are given time. Vampiro officially signed his contract this week. There were reports that the entire Mexican crew was going to sign 3-year contracts at Nitro this week, but it didn't happen, although it is expected to happen in the next month or so. No word on the status of La Parka. When the Cardinals, featuring Mark McGuire, the hottest act in sports, were playing the Braves on TBS last week, it drew the Braves' highest rating of the season, which was a 2.6. Compare that with an average Thunder, or even some of the WCW Saturday night ratings. By the way, no ratings this week at press time due to Labor Day holiday. The production company that Jason Hervey's mother is an integral part of is developing a movie for Sting. Why is it that wrestlers who can't even act within the context of pro wrestling, Sting/Scott Steiner, are getting acting gigs while some of the tremendous actors in wrestling don't? Benoit was at Nitro and very unhappy since he was flown in for the show, then told he wasn't going to be part of the show. He's about 4 weeks from being ready to wrestle again. While he hasn't signed, the odds are that if the Horseman deal doesn't flop, he's going to sign because of the guaranteed money. Rage of High Voltage suffered a torn bicep in Jackson, Mississippi, and is expected to undergo surgery, so he'll be out for at least a month. There was some talk of having Duggan on TV this week doing an interview about his legit condition, but it was nixed by the higher-ups, apparently not wanting anything to overshadow the angles on the show. Updated major events schedule for November and December. November 2nd Nitro in Fort Lauderdale, November 3rd Saturday night tapings in Fort Myers, Florida, November 5th Thunder in Roanoke, November 7th House Show in Pittsburgh, November 9th Nitro at Nassau Coliseum, November 16th Nitro in Wichita, November 17th Saturday night taping in Salina, Kansas, November 22nd World War III pay-per-view at Palace in Auburn Hills, Michigan, November 23rd Nitro in Grand Rapids, November 30th Nitro in Chattanooga, December 1st Saturday night tapings in Rome, Georgia, December 2nd House Show in Nashville, December 3rd Thunder in Memphis, December 7th Nitro at the Astrodome in Houston, December 14th Nitro in Tampa, December 15th Saturday night tapings in Palmetto, Florida, December 17th Thunder in Charlotte, December 18th House Show in Winston-Salem, December 20th House Show in Kansas City, December 21st Nitro at the TWA Dome in St. Louis, December 27th Starrcade at MCI Arena in Washington, D.C., December 28th Nitro in Baltimore, December 29th House Show at Nassau Coliseum, and December 30th House Show at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. Frank Defford did a commentary on September 2nd about pro wrestling on National Public Radio. He said it amuses him how people can be bothered by athletes doing pro wrestling gigs. He called the Malone-Rodman match a harmless gig and said how TV critics went crazy when Jay Leno did a charity appearance because critics claimed it was beneath his dignity. And he said people claiming Tyson had disgraced boxing by doing wrestling had the most nerve of all since Tyson had long since disgraced boxing by boxing. He called this newsletter a publication that is as authoritative about wrestling as the New England Journal of Medicine is about disease. He basically said WCW was revived by Bischoff and has become a cult sensation on college campuses, and WWF has roared back, taking the low road and featuring Steve Austin, who appeals to everyone's worst instincts, although he meant that somewhat as a compliment. I never considered this, but the fact Bill Goldberg is Jewish has become a tremendous PR coup for WCW. There are many important media power brokers that are Jewish, and for that reason, the idea of a Jewish world heavyweight champion is one they are willing to do stories on. Goldberg has been getting several stories a week around the country in major newspapers, with more to come, and this past week was even in the New Yorker with a story on a rabbi and his daughter watching wrestling every Monday night to see him. The Miami Herald just did a story on parents Jed and Ethel. Spin magazine is working on a Goldberg piece. Rolling Stone and Entertainment Weekly are also working on pro wrestling pieces. The movie on Bret Hart and the Survivor Series main event from last year, called Wrestling with Shadows, is almost completed. The movie will air on TV in the United States around December and will be released to video much sooner. When the movie is completed, which should be within days, we'll have a rundown on it. I've seen a copy of the movie before the final edits were completed and will say it was the most honest movie about the wrestling industry ever done. Hart also has a role in the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids TV show. The Jackson, Tennessee Clarion Ledger ran a series of stories leading up to the Weekend House show. There was a story on DDP. He admitted wrestling was a show but still claimed that he really hated Savage and wanted to hurt him when they wrestled. One thing I want to note about DDP. While he is not a great worker and it is almost a joke how overpushed he's been due to connections, the fact is that he has not only been smart but has worked very hard to make himself a celebrity in this field by doing the interviews that others blow off and doing the charity appearances while others get drunk in their hotel rooms. He's had the opportunity from his push to become one, but he's also not dropped the ball when it comes to working with that push. But as you can see by the ratings, even with his push and his work, he is not someone that people tune in specifically to see. In this industry, making yourself a celebrity to the media which filters to the mainstream ends up being a lot more important than being a good technical worker or even the immediate fan reaction to you over the short haul. They had another story saying the WCW event was the quickest sellout they've ever had with the exception of when Garth Brooks comes to town, and noted how different it is today than 12 years ago when Hulk Hogan came to town and the local promoter lost $14,000, which I'm sure made Hogan thrilled. He noted wrestling was strong in the city in the mid-80s, Mid-South Wrestling, and then it died. WWF and WCW, and they didn't think it would ever come back. Although the stories were WCW-oriented, there was a fan who said he didn't attend the show because he couldn't get good seats. For WCW, it ain't worth going if you can't sit up close. But now if it was WWF, I probably would go. All their matches are entertaining. WWF. Preliminary estimates are that SummerSlam did an estimated 1.48 buy rate, which would be between 500,000 and 520,000 buys, which would be a $6.57 million gross, or in other words, a huge success. It would be along the same lines or just slightly behind what WCW did for the Bash at the Beach for Rodman and Malone, but far ahead of what WCW did with Jay Leno at Road Wild, which turned out to be about 322,000 buys or in 0.93 buy rate. WWF also received about 10,000 calls and grossed about $250,000 in merchandise sales, about half of which was Steve Austin merchandise, the hour after SummerSlam on the Home Shopping Network. WWF has produced a very limited quantity of Austin Rules, Goldberg Sucks t-shirts for sale at some major mall stores. They did what I assume was a publicity angle where Austin gave Regis Philbin a stunner on August 31st on his TV show, and Regis came back from the commercial with his face all taped up claiming he had broken his nose. Regis had claimed years ago to suffer a broken finger back in his Los Angeles early 60s days with Freddie Blassie. Austin suffered a dislocated jaw when he collided with Undertaker early in their match and also bit a chunk of his tongue. Undertaker underwent back spasms fairly early in the match as well, but both gutted out a very good match anyway. After getting a second MRI done this past week, Hunter Hearst Helmsley was given this past week off from scheduled house shows, but the knee at this point won't require surgery. Kurt Angle has signed a multi-year contract with the WWF. His next work will be at the September training camp. Farouk missed some dates because his brother was murdered in a shooting. Steve Blackman and Animal both underwent arthroscopic knee surgery this past week and are expected back in the ring around October 1st. They are doing an angle with Hawk claiming he's in rehab, which he isn't. They timed Hawk's rehab angle with when Animal was getting his knee done, and in October Hawk in the story may conquer his demons and the two will be back in gear. Only problem is, they'll still suck. Hawk is in poor physical condition partially because he's recovering from numerous real health problems not limited to problems with his liver and hepatitis C. Mick Foley was originally going to be given time off until the pay-per-view, but with the pay-per-view being headlined by the triple threat match, in order for the house show main events to not duplicate the pay-per-view main event, they've changed the house show mains to Fatal 4-Ways with Cactus Jack returning to gain revenge for what Undertaker and Kane did to Mankind. And you can see the obvious tag matches stemming from that. So he'll be back on the road starting on September 11th in Calgary. Both Sergeant Slaughter and Gerald Briscoe will be on the road as special referees for those matches. Undertaker and Austin were off the house shows this past week because they were smaller arenas. Triple H and X-Pac were replaced against the Nation by New Age Outlaws due to Triple H's bad knee and figuring they should just send Outlaws to be the DX tag team against the Nation. Owen Hart was replaced by Mark Henry against Ken Shamrock since Hart had been bothered with a groin pull for a few weeks. They decided to let him have the week off as well. Shawn Michaels and Sable were off the recent TV tapings doing PR work at the proposed new WWF hotel in Las Vegas. Sable spent 2 days in Vegas and the rest of the week in Hollywood doing the episode of Pacific Blue in which she'll play a prisoner in an all-women's prison. And I'll just bet women's prisons are filled with women who look exactly like that. Both Jerry Lawler and Lance Russell will play themselves in the Man on the Moon movie about the late Andy Kaufman, which is starring Jim Carrey, which means Lawler gets to piledriver Carrey. Jimmy Hart, who managed and took care of Kaufman when he was doing his wrestling in Memphis in 1982-83, won't be in the movie due to the wrestling politics of WCW not wanting him involved in a movie that Lawler was in. It was really weird on the very forgettable episode of Raw that aired late on September 5th that during the Jarrett match, Lawler, in referring to Jarrett's new crew cut, said he now looks like Jill, and Jim Ross almost grudgingly appeared to say, "That's his wife," in reference to Jill Jarrett. It was weird because Jill Jarrett lost a lot of hair undergoing chemo for breast cancer. Ed Ferrara is the third man along with Vince McMahon and Vince Russo that are currently writing Raw. Ferrara formerly wrote for the short-lived USA Network show Duckman. It isn't exactly like they got a writer who wrote Friends. There is a much larger circle of about a dozen people who regularly submit ideas that are used on TV. Dan Severn apparently complained to Jim Ross about not being allowed to bring his NWA and UFC belts to the ring or be acknowledged as NWA champion, apparently a Russo decision, and we're told that decision may be changed. There is no target date for Shawn Michaels' return to the ring other than guesses of toward the end of the year or beginning of next year. He's down quite a bit in weight right now. There are many ideas that have been thrown around but none are locked in stone about whether he'll feud with DX or be in DX, or others will break away from DX when he joins, but there is none of those positions, or potentially others that are locks until the time comes that he can return. The character of Abu, the sidekick of Tiger Ali Singh, was dumped in favor of Babu, who started at last week's TVs. Babu is wrestler Pablo Marquez, who has also worked as Ubas and El Puerto Ricano in ECW. They wanted someone who could take bumps for angles as he's a very good bump taker and work manager's style matches if needed. On the deal from New Haven with the stripper, they edited most of him making out with the stripper off the air. Savio Vega will be seeing a neurologist on September 18th about all the problems with his neck. Miguel Perez is back, and speaking of back, he shaved his, which I guess ends his most heat-getting chance. It looks like they are going to heavily push this coming weekend an Austin vs. Ken Shamrock match as the September 14th Raw main event from San Jose when they go back to head-to-head. Godfather should be in San Jose, although he's probably several weeks away from wrestling. Steve Williams isn't expected back until around November. Steven Regal will be brought back to the September WWF training camp to work on his physique and conditioning for a restart. They want him to tighten up his upper body. In Vince McMahon's America Online chat when he hinted WWF may be back on a network slot, there is nothing close to imminent and there have been a lot of queries based on the strong cable ratings, but the most likely scenario would be something on Fox. Fox is also still very much talking about starting its own wrestling company, however. Austin will co-host Good Morning New York on the local Fox station in New York most likely on October 13th. Vader dropped weight from the high 370s down to about 345 at the August 31st weigh-in in New Haven. The company wants him at 325 to 330, figuring less weight will make it easier on his knees and back and leave him less injury prone. Undertaker dropped from 330 to 315. They want Mark Henry, who is about 385, to drop to the 340 to 350 range so he'll have a better physique and be more mobile. Al shows this week saw September 1st TV taping in Lowell, Massachusetts drew a sellout 6,441, paying $142,505. September 2nd in Cohasset, Massachusetts drew a sellout 2,182, paying $51,077. September 3rd in Hyannis, Massachusetts drew a sellout 2,157, paying $50,413. September 4th in Warwick, Rhode Island drew a sellout 2,994, paying $73,079, and September 5th in Springfield, Massachusetts drew 6,542, paying $121,989 for shows without either Undertaker or Austin ever booked and with DX vs. Nation in a tag, Kane vs. Vader and Shamrock vs. Hart as the advertised top bouts. Merchandise for the week was $137,137 or $6.75 per head. WWF has a Raw set for the new Schottenstein Center at Ohio State University on November 17th, while WCW has Nitro in the same building on January 18th. The Ken Shamrock movie Champions, where Shamrock plays, get this, a UFC star, is being released shortly to video. The readers' pages. Hall of Fame. I was surprised to find Gene Mr. America Stanley omitted from your list of Hall of Famers. Before Antonino Rocca came along, he was the biggest star in the metropolitan New York and East Coast area. Tall, bleached blonde, resplendent in sequined jackets and Roman gladiator-style boots, he struck quite a figure when compared to all the competition of the late 40s and early 50s. One might compare him to Buddy Rogers in ring presence, except that Rogers could wrestle and he couldn't. He had to share the number one spotlight when Rocca arrived. Jack Pfeffer finally matched them at the Jersey City ballpark before a huge crowd, with Rocca winning. Several years later, Stanley teamed with his brother Steve and eventually turned heel. He then disappeared from wrestling for several years. His second tenure in wrestling was short-lived. Vince McMahon Sr. brought him back and he wasn't forgotten by old-time fans. Crowd cheered him similar to how Ric Flair is received today. He teamed with Johnny Valentine for a while and once again retired. Based upon charismatic popularity and the gates he drew, Gene Stanley was a definite star in his day in this area and deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Howard Siegel. Yonkers, New York. I found Dos Caras to be an interesting entrant in the Observer Hall of Fame. The first time I ever saw him was in late 1994 on EMLL television. He displayed an abundance of mat wrestling maneuvers that were still innovative in the time frame he was using them in. That was impressive when you consider how much Lucha Libre has changed since he had started his career in 1970. I found the only flaw in his style was his lack of selling. That might be a reason why he looked so impressive to many people, similar to why Mil Mascaras looked so impressive to everyone the first time they saw him. The non-selling aspect is probably why Dos Caras, Mascaras and Connect were huge stars in their heyday. Despite his age, he can still hang in with the current generation of wrestlers in Japan and Mexico. The only other wrestler of his age who can boast that is Gran Hamada. Dos was very impressive in the Michinoku Pro Masked Man tournament in 1995, working a solid style that got over, especially when being compared with the more suicidal style of Great Sasuke. His tournament final match against Sasuke was in the 4 stars range. It was the match where Sasuke fractured his skull. His performance on that tour was probably why he was invited to the second Super J Cup later that year. His matches against El Samurai and Gedo were excellent. He displayed a style that was unique and helped differentiate his matches from the rest of the matches on the show. All Japan released a commercial tape last year that highlighted the tag team tournaments from 1977 to 79. The tape contained several highlights of Mascaras and Caras as a team. He was definitely an awesome worker in the 70s. His high flying was excellent, and probably revolutionary during that time frame. They probably ranked up with the Funk Brothers in popularity at the time. It's amazing that he wasn't as famous as his brother on an international level. He was a better worker when you compare him to his brother at the same age. I find it amazing that Carlos Colon was never voted into the Hall of Fame. Granted, it leaves a bad taste in everyone's mouth because Jose Gonzalez is still part of his promotion, but you can't deny he was a consistent headliner and top draw in Puerto Rico for more than 20 years. No Puerto Rican wrestler has ever accomplished as much as he did, although none probably ever had his lack of morals by allowing Gonzalez to remain with the promotion. I'm surprised that Kerry Von Erich didn't do better in the balloting. He was one of the most popular and recognizable wrestling stars in the early and mid-80s. Granted, his run only lasted a few years before he and his family self-destructed, but he was one hell of a drawing card both inside and outside of his territory during his prime. He was in demand by all the promoters in the territorial days and in Japan. I can't see Sergeant Slaughter even being considered. I remember him being extremely popular from his notoriety as a G.I. Joe character. After he left the WWF at the end of 1984, he bounced around independents and the AWA, and was about as annoying as Jim Duggan. He was never much of a drawing card after 1985. I will remember him best for his tasteless run as an Iraqi sympathizer in 1990-91. The sting was ridiculous after he won the WWF title, since WWF had to pretend the Persian Gulf War was still going on after it had already ended. Eric Bimbin. Brooklyn, New York. Now that the Hall of Fame is 3 years old, do you have any regrets about the original class? The current situations of Vader, the Road Warriors and Bret Hart made me cringe when I read over the August 24th issue. I guess this is how Mets fans felt watching Willie Mays at the end. Tracy Byers. Durham, North Carolina. Response from Dave Meltzer, not on those three, although it's really sad to see just how far the Road Warriors have fallen and how Vader is being used. Hart is still pushed as a top guy. Warriors, Hart and Vader to me are all guys who have to be in. Warriors were huge everywhere in the world in the mid-80s and top draws and huge money players. Vader was huge everywhere he went, held world titles all over the world, U.S., Japan, Mexico and even Austria. And is one of the all-time legendary Americans in Japan, and at his peak was the best worker of his size ever in this business, and I'd go so far as to say that nobody even comes close when it comes to that statement. Along with Shawn Michaels and Mitsuharu Misawa, Hart is probably one of the leading candidates for the Wrestler of the Decade for the 90s. The only one I'd question would be Antonio Pena, but realistically, for his work booking EMLL when it was on fire and in creating AAA, which changed the entire face of Mexican wrestling, he really has to be in for his creativity. AAA is terrible now, but it still draws. Excellent work on the Hall of Fame issue. I agree with you as far as your picks of Cactus Jack and Jimmy Snuka. Snuka was a main eventer for roughly 15 years. I would leave Undertaker and Hiroshi Hase off, however. Undertaker will be a no-brainer in a few more years, whereas Cactus Jack may not even be around at that time. Hase, although being a great worker, was usually overshadowed through his own booking. I still feel you're omitting one of the all-time greats in John Tolos. Richard Morris. Hazlitt, New Jersey. Response from Dave Meltzer. Problem with Tolos is I grew up watching him. He was a great talker and was in great condition for guys of that time period, but wasn't much in the ring. He was a big star in Los Angeles as a single in the 70s from the Fred Blassie feud, and the LA TV made him something of a name elsewhere, although Roy Shire never used him as anything more than an opening match guy. He and his brother were a top tag team in the 60s, but overall I see Tolos as well below the level of a Dick Murdoch. Hall. It seems every week when I receive the newsletter in the mail, there is always another story about Scott Hall's problems. Drugs. Booze. Sexual assaults. What's next? I'll tell you what's next. A nice write-up in your next tributes booklet. Michael Maroney. Roslindale, Massachusetts. How many more rampages is Scott Hall going to get away with before management gets tired of him and realizes he's of no use to WCW? He can't sell. He barely can work. Instead of rehab, maybe he should go back to wrestling school. Someone like Hall makes the company look bad, especially when the company turns its back on the situation and lets him run amok and just embarrasses the company even more. After watching 4 ECW pay-per-view shows, it's safe to say ECW should stick with producing TV and leave pay-per-view alone. After Barely Legal, they dropped the ball and haven't been able to recover. The Dudleys either don't or won't sell. New Jack jumps off balconies. Tommy Dreamer can barely do moves. Rob high spots that don't mean a thing. Van Dam shows ECW is just America's garbage wrestling promotion. Most of their fans have no clue and try and recreate the ECW atmosphere at other indie shows and fail badly. The term bingo hallmarks is starting to make the rounds. Here's an idea. Paul Heyman should shut down ECW and open up an actual wrestling company. He might be more profitable then. Bill Walkowitz. Rochester, New Hampshire. Response from Dave Meltzer. What pro wrestling is what can remain viable within the world of pro wrestling. If garbage wrestling can economically survive, just as any other form of wrestling, then it is what actual pro wrestling during this time is. What pro wrestling was makes for sometimes interesting history, but doing something different, If it makes it economically and ECW has survived in situations most have failed and has made it as a viable pay-per-view entity, then ECW style is part of pro wrestling. Besides, a lot of what both WWF and WCW have used to revitalize the wrestling industry has been taken from concepts popularized earlier in ECW. A&E. Your breakdown and analysis of the A&E wrestling special was phenomenal. I was amazing at just how many fallacies you were able to expose and correct in just a 2-hour program. One issue that was touched upon was the Andre the Giant as a shooter myth and how Akira Maeda exposed that myth. I was wondering if you would go into further detail about that particular situation. When did it happen and what were the details that led to the situation? Did Maeda shoot on Andre, or did he simply refuse to cooperate in putting Andre over and thus exposed him? Why does WCW have such a tiny ring? Am I the only one who thinks there are a number of detriments their undersized ring brings to the product? Suspension of disbelief cannot be maintained during tag team matches. The ring is so small that nowhere in the ring can a wrestler be cut off by the other team, thus restricting him from making a tag. At least in a WWF ring, you can believe that a wrestler could be cut off from making the tag to his partner. In WCW, a wrestler is never more than 1 or 2 paces away from making a tag, thus killing much of the drama of a hot tag. Submission holds can only be executed dead center in the ring. Otherwise, a rope break is always inches away. Submissions can't be built as effectively because almost anywhere they're done, the recipient of the hold is close to the ropes. Transitions. This may be the most glaring fault in having the small ring. There are many outstanding athletes in WCW who simply don't have enough room to move around. So many transition moves, in particular when a wrestler is whipped into the ropes and comes back on the return, are botched because there's not enough space to execute fast-paced transitional moves cleanly and correctly. The wrestling product would improve dramatically with a larger ring. Doesn't anyone in WCW notice this, and why haven't they made a change? George Guida Jr. Stoneham, Massachusetts. Response from Dave Meltzer. Andre and Maeda had a singles match in April 1986 as part of the IWGP tournament. I don't know what exactly led to Andre's actions, as there were stories that certain people in New Japan wanted to show Maeda up and have Andre embarrass him and kill his shooter reputation or at least take it down a peg, and others that Andre simply showed up to the match drunk and decided to embarrass Maeda on his own. Basically, Andre wouldn't sell any of Maeda's submission holds early, which was Maeda's gimmick. The match completely fell apart. It was never an all-out fight, per se, but in a sense turned into a limited shoot. Andre basically stood there and dared Maeda to attack. Maeda looked to the corner and asked one of the officials if it would be okay, and the official said no. However, based out of fear, it turned into a limited fight to a degree. What happened was Maeda began throwing blistering leg kicks, particularly to Andre's knee, and Andre was too slow to block anything. His knee swelled up really bad until eventually it couldn't handle his huge body weight and he collapsed, very similar to Paul Verhoeven's in the UFC match with Marco Ruiz. A few times as this was going on, Maeda closed in, and every time he was able to take Andre down with ease, but he was never allowed to follow up, as you can see him almost ask, "Can I finish him?" when Andre would go down. Andre got up a few times but quickly blew up, and once the knee couldn't handle the weight, he was down for good and laid on his back and dared Maeda to come to the ground with him, which Maeda wouldn't, basically because he was waiting for a signal that it would be okay. After several minutes of this kind of a stalemate, Antonio Inoki hit the ring and ended the fiasco. The match was built up big throughout the tour, as the two had never done a singles match since Maeda returned from the first UWF with the shooter gimmick. I believe Andre and Maeda did wrestle a singles match in the 1983 IWGP Heavyweight Tournament, and I'd assume based on the pecking order at that time that Andre won, and was taped for television, but New Japan would never let the tape air, although a bootleg copy is around on the black market somewhere, as I've seen the match many times. Maeda never hurt Andre, although it appeared had he wanted to he could have ended Andre's career based on that. Andre blew up, had no reflexes or speed as he never came close to blocking one of Maeda's kicks, had no balance standing, and had no ground skill. By this time Andre was almost 40 and probably around 520 pounds, so this is not to say what an in shape Andre at 25 would have been, but the point as it relates to And and the comments by Hogan and McMahon are that it was 1 year before the Hogan match. It should also be noted that when they were on the ground before the match completely fell apart and Andre wasn't selling Maeda's holds, Andre was trying to get his finger in Maeda's eyes, so in that sense, between the no selling and the attempts at a gouge, he was the one who was unprofessional first. Future. I was thinking about what the future holds for pro wrestling, and I think it's bright. Unlike during the 1980s, when the big companies were booming, the independents were dying out and most of the wrestlers getting pushed were steroid freaks. Independents have made a comeback, and you don't necessarily have to be a steroid freak to get a big push. Although there aren't as many name wrestlers in the business as there were in the 80s, the overall work rate is far better. The young talent like Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero and Kanyon are encouraging. I think WCW really missed the boat in turning Marcus Bagwell back heel, but then again they missed the boat so many times they should call the company Gilligan's Island. His return to the ring could have been built up as something really special. It just shows how much business sense Eric Bischoff and WCW truly lack. The last thing they needed was to add another wrestler to the NWO because it's already at the point where unless a wrestler is in the NWO or it's Bill Goldberg, nobody cares about it. The proof was at the Forum House show in Los Angeles. Nobody cared about the good wrestling match Dean Malenko and Ultimo Dragon were putting on. They barely cared about Rey Mysterio Jr. No wonder I spend Monday nights watching Raw. Byron Rodriguez. Monterey Park, California. Best matches. I have to admit I couldn't resist trying to name the best matches of all time. Especially when you brought up All Japan, which would be the promotion where it would be the most debated when it comes to best of lists. With All Japan it's like which 5 stars match do you choose between? Still, I thought I'd give it my best shot. 1. 6-95 Misawa and Kobashi vs. Kawada and Tao. The legendary 42 minutes tag match which finally saw Kawada pin Misawa. Arguably the most heat I've ever seen for any match ever. 2. 6-94 Misawa vs. Kawada. This was right after Kawada had won the Champion Carnival on the previous tour. He went on to lose to Misawa in an incredible 36 minutes match. 3. 6-97 Misawa vs. Kawada. I realize this is like beating a dead horse, but they always put on a summer classic. This was probably their last 5-star match. 4. 9-94 Kobashi vs. Steve Williams. Just a great 41 minutes match with both guys putting in great performances. 5. January 1997 Misawa vs. Kobashi. Probably the best singles match between the two. 42 minutes of off-the-charts psychology coupled with amazing crowd heat. To do a best of for rings would be wrong in my eyes. It should just be labeled the best of Folk Han. Han is easily Ring's all-time most entertaining performer. I can't even fathom what Ring's cards would be like without him. With the possible exception of Mitsuya Nagai vs. Yoshihisa Yamamoto and the 1996 Budokan Hall match with Ilyakine Mikhail vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka, I can't think of any Rings match I'd put on the list that doesn't involve Han. When I think of Han, I always think back to his match with Andrei Kopylov. This was one of Kopolov's first matches in Rings and Han totally carried him to an unbelievable match before putting him over at the end. Of course you can't forget his modern classics with Kiyoshi Tamura and Kosaka, and the fact he was the one who put Kosaka on the map. This list might be different if I were to include shoots, because then Frank Shamrock vs. Kosaka would make the list. For Pancrase. 1. 9-96 Boss Rutan vs. Masakatsu Funaki. Just an amazing match with Rutan handing Funaki a horrifying beating in the process. 2. 9-97 Yuki Kondo vs. Jason DeLucia. Both guys go 27 minutes in a great contest. 3. 12-94 Manabu Yamada vs. Minoru Suzuki. 4. 9-96 Frank Shamrock vs. Yuki Kondo. 5. 5-96 Frank Shamrock vs. Boss Rutan. This bout really displayed Rutan's striking prowess. For ECW. 1. September 95 Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Psychosis. An unbelievable 2 out of 3 fall match. 2. 2-97 Mysterio Jr. vs. Juventud Guerrera. Their 2 out of 3 fall match. 3. Eddie Guerrero vs. Dean Malenko 30 minutes draw which put ECW on the world stage when it came to presenting great wrestling. 4. The Michinoku 6-man tag from the barely legal pay-per-view. 5. Cactus Jack vs. Sandman death match with Jack beating Sandman's brains in with awesome chair shots. Jonathan D'Antoni. Melrose, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer. With All Japan, there are so many classics to choose from that to me it's the matches that make the most long-term impression. Matches that I vividly recall to this day include the 1981 Tag Team Tourney Final with Bruiser Brody and Jimmy Snuka vs. Funks. For Impact at the time this was awesome. A few Jumbo Tsuruta vs. Genichiro Tenryu singles matches when they had their feud. A 30 minutes draw with Tsuruta and Tenryu vs. Choshu and Yatsu. A tag tourney final with Hansen and Gordy vs. Tenryu and Kawada. Misawa's first win over Tsuruta. Because I was there live and saw all the people crying at the finish. Kawada vs. Kobashi 60 minutes draw from Osaka. Misawa and Kobashi vs. Kawada and Tao Tag Team Tournament Finals. the 6-94 Misawa vs. Kawada and January 97 Misawa vs. Kobashi and the famous Kobashi vs. Williams that you noted I can vividly recall as amazing matches. But there are just so many in that promotion that you could pick 25 and the last one on your list could just as well be your first pick. Without question that company has the most all-time classics of all the modern wrestling companies. For rings, my favorite without question was the recent Kosuke vs. Tamura, with Han's matches with Tamura following. Tamura's shoot matches with Kosuke, as opposed to the recent match which was a work, and Yamamoto and Frank Shamrock vs. Kosuke would rank as the best shoot matches in the company along with the recent Toyonaga vs. Namakawa match. For Pancrase, the three matches that stand out in my mind are Rutan vs. Funaki, which is unquestioned number 1, Frank Shamrock vs. Kondo and Frank Shamrock vs. Alan Goes, and probably Funaki vs. Frank Shamrock right after that followed by the Yamada vs. Suzuki. The funny thing is that my belief, and I can say that several insiders believe this as well and if you watch the tape you see it, is that Funaki vs. Rutan was actually the most brutal worked match in the history of the world. To show Funaki's guts, my belief is that Rutan, one of the most feared strikers if not the most feared in the world, wasn't in on the work. My belief is you can see in the brawls Funaki sticking his head right into the path of brutal punches and kicks so he could believably be knocked down so many times to create a monster foreign champion for business because he didn't believe that their smart fans would believe a finish where Rutan made him submit. Anyway, that's a theory several insiders have on that match and they could be wrong. Even though this wasn't a long exciting match, there is something about the 1995 Ken Shamrock vs. Rutan match which went only a few seconds with Shamrock winning that I thought was tremendous, only because it was a real match with two great competitors and it's where you really find out just how good Shamrock as a shooter really was. For ECW, I totally agree on the first two matches, but it seemed to me at the time that every month Mysterio Jr. and Psicosis were putting on matches that were the best in the world at the time and probably 3 of their bouts should be on the ECW all-time top 5 or 6. At the end of 1989, Jeff Bowdren in a Wrestling Observer yearbook actually put together a list of the 100 best matches of that decade. It would really be scary to try and undertake that task for the 90s. His top 20 were 1. Flair vs. Steamboat May-July 89 Nashville. 2. Sayama vs. Dynamite Kid August 23/83 Tokyo. 3. Lioness Asuka vs. Jaguar Yokota August 22/85 Tokyo. 4. Flair vs. Steamboat February 20, 1989 Chicago. 5. Flair vs. Kerry Von Erich December 25, 1982 Dallas. 6. Choshu and Yatsu vs. Tsuruta and Tenryu January 28, 1986 Tokyo. 7. Flair vs. Wyndham February 14, 1986 Orlando. 8. Asuka vs. Chigusa Nagio February 26, 1987 Kawasaki. 9. Tatsumi Fujinami vs. Akira Maeda June 12, 1986 Osaka. 10. Choshu and Fujinami and Maeda and Kengo Kimura and Super Strong Machine vs. Inoki and Seiji Sakaguchi and Keiji Muto and Taro Hoshino and Yoshiaki Fujiwara August 19/87 Tokyo. 11. Sayama vs. Dynamite Kid August-May 82 Tokyo. 12. Flair vs. Steamboat April 2/89 New Orleans. 13. Bill Dundee and Buddy Landell vs. Jerry Lawler and Dutch Mantle March 24, 1986 Memphis. 14. Flair vs. Terry Funk November 15, 1989 Troy, New York. 15. Flair vs. Wyndham January 20, 1987 Fayetteville, North Carolina. 16. Misawa vs. Kunyaki Kobayashi June 21, 1985 Tokyo. 17. Ted DiBiase vs. Jim Duggan, Can You Believe It? And I remember this match vividly and it absolutely belongs. March 22, 1985 Houston. 18. Hansen and Gordy vs. Tenryu and Kawada December 16, 1988 Tokyo. 19. Eddie Gilbert and Ricky Morton vs. Atsushi Onita and Masafuchi 1981 Tupelo, Mississippi. And 20. Inoki and Fujinami and Cobra George Takano vs. Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith and David Schultz July 1, 1984 Tokyo. Looking back at that list, those matches stand the test of time because I've got vivid memories of all of them. FMW. I'd agree with Eric Bimbin's letter in the July 28th issue about FMW. The more tapes I see, the more I like it. I like to see a lot more of Hayabusa in ECW, and like to see what he could do working with the New Japan Junior Heavyweights. Regarding Music City Wrestling, I agree about Burt Prentice's announcing. I've often wondered what fans watching TV elsewhere think about the parking situation at the Nashville Fairgrounds. Recently Michael St. John has returned. While I think he's also a bad announcer, he at least calls the match. Alan Berry has joined him on commentary and has done a great job so far. I really miss the USWA angles. Prentice does keep everything simple, but recently there have been two new good angles, somewhat reality-based. The Chris Michaels turn on Shane Eden because he thinks Eden is hogging the space at the gimmick table, and Prentice versus Bill Behrens. This angle has been a lot of fun, with Behrens playing heel owner trying to get Prentice to raise ticket prices and hot dog prices, and Behrens bringing in the Georgia wrestlers. I consider Prentice to be a very good independent promoter. When you go to a Prentice show, it's going to start on time. If he promotes, a name is going to be there. It probably are, and if not, it's usually a situation out of his hands. He runs a very organized show, which is rare for indies. He knows what the fans want and gives them it. Sadly, the fans in this area are educated to a southern comedy crap style, but he has enough good workers and enough hardcore action to keep my attention. But I must say that after all, the family show Mumbo Jumbo named Ken's Gold Club, a strip joint, as his main sponsor is impossible to swallow. Trent Vandress, Madison, Tennessee. This is the end of this program. See you next time.